The dust of beaver. Utah settled into Beatrice Porter's lungs like everything else that had tried to bury her over the past 3 years, and she wondered if this was what defeat tasted like. Standing outside the small mercantile where she'd just been turned away for the seamstress position, she clutched her worn carpet bag and tried to remember when hope had stopped being a companion and started being a cruel joke. 24 years old, and already she felt ancient, weathered by a husband who'd gambled away their ranch before dying in a saloon brawl, leaving her with nothing but debts and a reputation she didn't deserve. The afternoon sun beat down on her dark hair, and she could feel the stares of the townspeople boring into her back as they whispered about the widow who couldn't even keep her man alive, let alone happy. She moved down the wooden sidewalk, her boots making hollow sounds that echoed her empty stomach. 3 months of traveling from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, and she'd ended up here in this small Mormon settlement in the high desert, hoping distance would give her a fresh start. But rumors traveled faster than stage coaches, and somehow the story of her husband's death and the debts he'd left had preceded her. No one wanted to hire a woman with that kind of shadow hanging over her head. The general store sat at the corner of Main Street, its windows displaying tins of peaches and bolts of calico that she couldn't afford. She'd been sleeping in the livery stable, trading what little jewelry she had left for meals, and she knew she had maybe 2 more days before she'd have to move on again. But move on to where? She'd run out of west to go to. Beyond Utah territory lay Nevada and California, but she didn't have the money for a stage ticket, and walking through the desert alone was suicide. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and warm like honey and tea, and she turned to find a man standing there with his hat in his hands. He was tall, probably 6 feet or more, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of cedar wood. His brown hair curled slightly at his collar, and he had the lean, muscular build of someone who worked with cattle and horses. "I don't mean to be forward, but I couldn't help overhearing Mrs. Hutchins turn you away back there. I'm looking for someone who can cook and help around my ranch. The pay is fair, room and board included, and the work is honest." Beatrice studied him carefully, looking for the signs she'd learned to recognize in men. The predatory gleam, the assumption that a desperate woman would accept any terms. But this man's eyes were straightforward, almost kind, and he maintained a respectful distance. Still, she'd been fooled before. "I don't know you," she said flatly, "and I've learned that strangers offering help usually want something in return. Name's Owen McKay. I've got a ranch about 5 miles north of town, raising cattle and breaking horses. My cook left 2 weeks ago to get married, and I've been burning every meal since. I'm not asking you to trust me, just to come see the place in daylight with your own horse so you can leave whenever you want. Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house can vouch for my character if you want to ask her first." "Why me?" Beatrice asked, suspicion still coloring her voice. "You don't know if I can cook worth a damn." "Because you've got the look of someone who's been kicked when they're down, and I've been there myself. Sometimes all a person needs is one chance to prove what they're capable of." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be at the livery stable in an hour if you decide you want to take a look. No obligation either way." He walked off before she could respond, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Beatrice watched him go, torn between cynicism and the desperate need for exactly what he was offering. Food, shelter, wages. The chance to stop running, at least for a while. She found Mrs. Patterson in the boarding house parlor, a formidable woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. When Beatrice mentioned Owen McKay's name, the older woman's expression softened. "Owen's a good man," she said firmly. "Lost his parents to cholera when he was 16 and built that ranch up from nothing over the past 10 years. He's got a reputation for being fair with his workers and honest in his dealings. Quiet fellow, keeps to himself mostly, but he'll give you a fair shake if you're willing to work." She paused, then added more gently, "I heard about your troubles, Mrs. Porter. Not everyone in this town is quick to judge. Owen least of all. If he's offering you work, it's because he needs the help, nothing more." An hour later, Beatrice stood in the livery stable as Owen saddled a gentle mare for her. True to his word, he'd arranged for her to have her own mount, though she suspected he'd paid for the rental himself. They rode north out of town in silence, the October afternoon cooling as they climbed into the foothills. The landscape was beautiful in a stark way, red rock formations rising against brilliant blue sky, sagebrush and juniper dotting the hillsides. She could see why someone would want to build a life out here. The McKay ranch appeared as they crested a rise, and Beatrice felt something in her chest loosen slightly. It wasn't grand, but it was well maintained. A sturdy log house with a covered porch, a large barn, several corrals with good fencing, and a bunkhouse that looked recently repaired. Chickens scratched in a yard near the house, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. It spoke of careful attention and honest labor. Owen dismounted and helped her down, though she noticed he released her arm the moment her feet touched ground. "House is this way. I should tell you up front, I've got 3 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Miguel, James, and Tommy. They're good men, but if having them around makes you uncomfortable, I understand. I'm not afraid of hard work or men who do honest labor," Beatrice said, lifting her chin. "What exactly would you expect from me? 3 meals a day for me and the hands. Keeping the house clean, doing laundry, mending when needed. Maybe helping with the chickens and the kitchen garden. I'd pay you $20 a month plus room and board. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door, and I'd expect the men to treat you with complete respect. Anyone who doesn't answers to me." $20 was more than fair for the work described. It was generous, actually. Beatrice walked onto the porch and looked out over the ranch. She could see herself here, at least temporarily. It would give her time to save money, to figure out her next move. Maybe even to catch her breath after 3 years of running. "I'll take the job," she said, turning to face him. "But I want to be clear about something, Mr. McKay. I'm not looking for anything beyond honest work and fair pay. My husband died, and I'm not interested in replacing him. If you're expecting something else down the line, you should say so now." Owen met her eyes steadily. "I'm offering you a job, Mrs. Porter. Nothing more, nothing less. You work as long as you want, and when you're ready to move on, you go with my blessing and whatever wages you've earned." "Fair enough," she nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He showed her through the house, which was clean but had the bachelor plainness of a man who didn't care about comfort beyond function. The kitchen was spacious with a good cast iron stove, and she noted the supplies were well stocked. Her room was small but private, with a bed, dresser, and washstand. The window looked out over the ranch yard, and when she tested the lock on the door, it was solid. "I'll ride back to town and get your things," Owen said from the doorway. "You can settle in and look around. Supper's usually at 6, but don't worry about tonight. I'll bring back something from the hotel." "No need," Beatrice said, removing her shawl and hanging it on the peg by the door. "I'll cook tonight. It's what you're paying me for." She saw something flash in his eyes, respect maybe, before he nodded and left her alone. Beatrice stood in the center of her small room and felt the tight knot in her chest loosen another fraction. This wasn't a happy ending. She'd given up on those the day her husband had died and left her with nothing but shame and debt. But it was a beginning of sorts, and maybe that was enough. By the time Owen returned with her carpet bag, she had biscuits in the oven and salt pork frying with potatoes. The smell filled the house, and she heard him pause in the doorway before setting her bag in her room. The ranch hands came in at 6, removing their hats and looking surprised to find a woman in the kitchen. Owen introduced them simply. Miguel was older, maybe 40, with weathered brown skin and kind eyes. James was young, probably not more than 20, with red hair and freckles. Tommy was somewhere in between, stocky and quiet. They ate without much conversation, but she noticed they all had second helpings, and Miguel complimented her biscuits in Spanish-accented English. When they filed out to the bunkhouse, Owen stayed behind to help her clean up. "You don't have to do that," Beatrice said, surprised to find him rolling up his sleeves at the wash basin. "I can manage the dishes." "I'm sure you can, but my mother would rise from her grave if she knew I let a woman clean up alone after cooking for 5 people. He had a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, and she noticed for the first time that he had a dimple in his left cheek. "Besides, it gives us a chance to discuss how things work around here. What time works best for you to start breakfast?" They fell into an easy rhythm, discussing the practical details of running the household. Owen was straightforward and reasonable, listening when she suggested changes to the kitchen arrangement or asked about supplies. By the time the dishes were done and he'd bid her good night, Beatrice felt cautiously optimistic. Maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. The first week passed in a blur of activity. She rose before dawn to make breakfast, packed lunches for the men when they'd be working far pastures, prepared dinner that was hot and ready when they came in. She cleaned and mended, collected eggs and weeded the kitchen garden, and slowly began to put her own stamp on the house. Curtains appeared in the windows, made from flour sacks she'd bleached and hemmed. The parlor got a thorough cleaning, and she arranged the few books Owen owned on a shelf she'd asked him to build. He was a good employer, she had to admit. He thanked her for every meal, paid her the first week's wages without her having to ask, and maintained a careful distance that never felt cold. She'd catch him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read, but he never said or did anything inappropriate. The ranch hands treated her with respect bordering on reverence, especially after Miguel declared her biscuits better than his grandmother's. It was the second week when things began to shift, subtle as sunrise. Owen had been breaking a new horse, a spirited bay mare that didn't want to accept the saddle. Beatrice finished the breakfast dishes and walked out to the corral to watch, drawn by some impulse she didn't examine too closely. He moved with the horse with patience and confidence, his voice low and steady as he gentled her. There was something mesmerizing about it, the trust being built between man and animal through nothing but time and consistency. The mare finally allowed the saddle, and Owen looked up to find Beatrice watching. Instead of being embarrassed, she stayed where she was. "She's beautiful," Beatrice called out. "What's her name?" "Haven't named her yet. Bought her off a settler heading back east who couldn't handle her spirit." Owen led the mare closer to the fence. She just needed someone to take the time to understand her instead of trying to break her. Something in the way he said it made Beatrice think he wasn't just talking about the horse. She reached out carefully to stroke the mare's nose, and the horse huffed warm breath against her palm. "What would you name her?" Owen asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "Phoenix," Beatrice said without thinking, "because she's getting a second chance at a better life." Their eyes met over the horse's neck, and something passed between them, acknowledgement of shared understanding. Owen nodded slowly. "Phoenix it is." That afternoon, while kneading bread dough, Beatrice found herself humming. She stopped abruptly when she realized, surprised by the lightness in her chest. When had the heaviness started to lift? When had she stopped bracing for the next disaster? She looked around the kitchen, at the home she was building here even if it was temporary, and felt something dangerous blooming inside her. Hope. She tried to crush it immediately. Hope was what had gotten her hurt before. Hope was believing her husband when he said he'd stop gambling, that he'd make things right. Hope was trusting that love would be enough to fix everything. And she'd learned the hard way that hope was just another word for self-delusion. But Owen made it difficult to maintain her cynicism. He'd ride in from the pastures and wash up carefully before coming to the table, thanking her for the meal with genuine appreciation. He'd notice when she was tired and send her to rest, doing the dishes himself. He'd brought her seeds for the garden without being asked, and a new apron when he'd noticed her old one was wearing thin. Small gestures, nothing grand, but they accumulated like snowfall, building into something she was afraid to name. One evening in late October, after the dinner dishes were done and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Owen asked if she'd like to sit on the porch. The air was cool but not cold, and the sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible. "I wanted to tell you that you're doing a fine job here," he said, settling into one of the wooden chairs he'd built. "The place feels like a home for the first time since my parents passed." "It's honest work," Beatrice replied, taking the other chair. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." "Can I ask you something personal? You can tell me to mind my own business if you want." He waited for her nod before continuing. "What made you give up on finding happiness? Because I've seen it in your eyes since the day we met. Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for the next bad thing to happen." The question caught her off guard, and she felt her defenses rise. But something about the gentle way he asked, without judgment or pity, made her answer honestly. "My husband was a dreamer," she said slowly. "He could make you believe anything was possible. We married when I was 19, and for 2 years I believed we were building something real. He'd inherited a small ranch from his father, and I thought we'd raise children there, grow old together. But he loved gambling more than he loved me, and eventually he lost everything. The ranch, our savings, even my mother's wedding ring. Then he got into a fight over a card game and died, leaving me with nothing but debts I couldn't pay and a reputation as the woman who drove her husband to ruin." "That's not what happened," Owen said quietly. "He made his choices, you just loved him despite them." "Love isn't enough," Beatrice said, and she hated how bitter she sounded. "I learned that the hard way, so yes, I gave up on happy endings. They don't exist for people like me. The best I can hope for is to survive with some dignity intact." Owen was silent for a long moment, and she thought maybe she'd revealed too much, scared him with the depth of her damage. But when he spoke, his voice was firm with conviction. "Let me write you a new story starting right this moment." She turned to look at him, confused. "What? Your old story was written by someone else's choices, someone else's failures. But that story is over. This is a new chapter, and you get to decide what happens next. Not your late husband, not the people who judge you, not anyone but you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes intense. "And maybe, if you're willing, we could write it together. Not because you need saving, but because I think we might make a good team." "You don't know me," Beatrice protested, even as her heart started beating faster. "You don't know what you're offering. I know you work hard. I know you're kind to my men and gentle with my animals. I know you hum when you think no one's listening, and you always save the last biscuit for whoever's still hungry. I know you put curtains in the windows to make this house a home, and you haven't complained once about the work even though I know it's exhausting." He held her gaze. "I know enough to know I'd like to know more, if you're willing." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes and she blinked them back furiously. I'm not ready for this. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just asking you to stop writing your story like it's already over, like you don't deserve another chapter." He stood up, respecting the space between them even as his words bridged it. "Think about it. I'll be here when you decide." He went inside, leaving her alone with the sunset and the wild hope rising in her chest like a flood. She wanted to push it down, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment, but his words echoed in her mind. "Let me write you a new story starting right this moment." What if she could? What if the past didn't have to define her future? She sat on that porch until the stars came out, wrestling with herself. By the time she went inside to her small room, she hadn't made a decision. But she hadn't dismissed the possibility either, and that was something. The next morning, she made Owen's favorite breakfast without consciously deciding to do so. Flapjacks with the wild blackberry preserves she'd made from berries she'd found on the property. When she set the plate in front of him, their eyes met, and she saw the question there. She didn't have an answer yet, but she managed a small smile, and she saw the way his face lit up in response over the following weeks. Something shifted between them. It wasn't a grand romance, not yet. It was smaller, quieter. Owen brought her wildflowers from the pasture, nothing fancy, just whatever was blooming. She mended his favorite shirt with special care, adding decorative stitching at the cuffs. They started sitting on the porch together most evenings, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his parents, how they'd made the journey west with nothing and built a life through sheer determination. She told him about her childhood in Missouri before everything went wrong. "I had a sister," she said one evening, surprising herself with the admission. "Anna. She died when I was 12, scarlet fever. My mother never really recovered from it. I think that's why she didn't fight harder when I said I wanted to marry young. She just didn't have the energy to care anymore." "I'm sorry," Owen said, and she could tell he meant it. "Loss changes us. Sometimes it makes us stronger, sometimes it just makes us tired." "Which did it make you?" He considered the question seriously. "Both, I think. Stronger because I had to be, tired because I've been doing it alone for so long." He looked at her. "Until now." November brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by afternoon, but promised harder weather to come. Beatrice found herself watching Owen more openly now, noticing things she tried to ignore before. The way his hands were gentle despite their strength. The laugh lines around his eyes. The care he took with everything he did, whether it was breaking a horse or building a fence. He was nothing like her husband had been, and she found herself grateful for the differences. One morning, she woke to find the kitchen stove already lit and coffee brewing. Owen was at the table, account books spread before him, working by lamplight in the pre-dawn darkness. "You're up early," she said, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd get some work done." He closed the books and poured her a cup of coffee, remembering exactly how she liked it. The small gesture touched her more than it should have. "I've been thinking about expanding the herd come spring, maybe buying more breeding stock. This ranch could support twice as many cattle as I'm running now." "That sounds like good planning," Beatrice said, sitting across from him. "You're a good rancher, Owen. Your parents would be proud of what you've built." "I hope so." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'd like to think this could be more than just a ranch someday. A real home with family. Children learning to ride, noise and laughter instead of just me rattling around alone." He looked up at her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. "Does that sound foolish?" "No," she whispered. "It sounds like exactly the kind of dream I used to have before I learned dreams could hurt you. Dreams only hurt when you give up on them too soon, or when you choose the wrong person to dream with." He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. "I think we could dream together and make it real, if you're brave enough to try." Beatrice looked at his hand, so close to hers, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Every instinct screamed at her to pull back, to protect herself from the inevitable pain. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, asked what if? What if Owen was different? What if this was her chance at the life she'd always wanted? She closed the distance between their hands, letting her fingers rest against his. His hand was warm and calloused, solid and real. He turned his palm up, and she laced her fingers through his, feeling the rightness of it settle into her bones. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "of wanting this. Of believing it could work. Of losing it all again." "I'm terrified too," Owen said, squeezing her hand gently. "But I think sometimes the bravest thing we can do is try anyway." They sat there as dawn broke outside, hands joined across the table, and Beatrice felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. It wasn't a grand declaration or a passionate embrace. It was quieter than that, more solid. It was two broken people deciding to trust each other with their carefully guarded hopes. The first kiss happened 3 days later, and it was nothing like Beatrice expected. She was making bread, flour dusting her arms up to the elbows when Owen came in from the barn. He'd been helping a cow through a difficult birth, and he looked exhausted but pleased. "Healthy calf," he announced. "A little bull strong as anything. Miguel's with them now." "That's wonderful," Beatrice said, smiling at his obvious joy. "Go wash up and I'll make you something to eat." But he didn't move toward the wash basin. Instead, he stood there looking at her with such tenderness that she felt her breath catch. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Do I have flour on my face?" "You're beautiful," he said simply. "Standing there in my kitchen, in the home we're building together, covered in flour and smiling because a calf was born healthy. You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She started to protest, to deflect the compliment as she always did, but he crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and cupped her face in his hands. He smelled like hay and honest work, and when he kissed her, it was gentle and reverent, like she was something precious. Beatrice's hands came up to grip his shirt, flour and all, and she kissed him back with 3 years of loneliness and fear and desperate hope. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and she could see her flour handprints on his chest. "I'm sorry," she said, laughing a little wildly. "I've made a mess of your shirt." "I don't care," Owen said, and kissed her again. This time it was deeper, more certain, and Beatrice felt herself falling into it without reservation. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Beatrice Porter. I know it's fast, and I know you might not be ready to hear it, but I needed to say it. I love you, and I want to build a life with you." The old Beatrice would have panicked, would have found a way to push him away to protect herself. But the new Beatrice, the one who was learning to trust again, looked into his cedar brown eyes and found the courage to be honest. "I love you too," she said, and felt the truth of it resonate through her entire body. "It terrifies me, but I do. I love you, Owen McKay." His smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. He kissed her once more, soft and sweet, then went to wash up while she returned to her bread with shaking hands and a heart that felt dangerously full. That evening, after the hands had eaten and retired to the bunkhouse, Owen asked Beatrice to marry him. There was no ring, no elaborate plan. They were washing dishes together, as they did every night, and he simply turned to her and asked. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need taking care of, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you make this house a home and my days make sense. Because I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. Marry me, Beatrice." She looked at him, this good man who'd offered her a job when she had nothing, who'd given her space to heal, who'd shown her through 1,000 small kindnesses that love didn't have to hurt. And she found herself nodding before she'd consciously made the decision. "Yes," she said, and then louder with more certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you." He picked her up and spun her around right there in the kitchen, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Beatrice felt something inside her finally, truly settle. This was real. This was happening. She was being given a second chance at happiness, and she was brave enough to take it. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Mormon church in Beaver. Mrs. Patterson stood as witness, along with Miguel, James, and Tommy. Beatrice wore a dress Mrs. Patterson had helped her make from fabric Owen had bought without her knowing, a soft blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Owen wore his Sunday best and couldn't stop smiling through the entire ceremony. The wedding night was tender and unhurried, Owen patient as Beatrice worked through her nervousness. He took his time, showing her with his body what he'd already proven with his actions. That she was cherished, that she was safe, that love didn't have to be painful or complicated. Afterward, lying in his arms in the bedroom that was now theirs, Beatrice felt tears slip down her temples. "Did I hurt you?" Owen asked, immediately concerned. "No," she said, wiping at her eyes. "I'm just happy. I didn't think I could feel this way again. I didn't think I deserved to." "You deserve everything good this world has to offer," Owen said firmly, pulling her closer. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." December brought serious snow, the kind that trapped them on the ranch for days at a time, but Beatrice didn't mind. The house was warm, the larder was full, and she had Owen. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other, or playing cards, or simply talking by the fire. The ranch hands joined them some nights, and the bunkhouse became too cold. And those evenings were filled with stories and laughter that made the small house feel like it could hold the whole world. On Christmas Eve, Owen gave her a small box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate gold locket on a chain. When she opened it, she found it empty. "I thought you might want to fill it yourself," he said. "With whatever memories you choose. Not your old life, but our new one, starting from the moment you decided to take a chance on us." Beatrice threw her arms around him, the locket clutched in her hand. "I don't need memories in a locket," she said against his neck. "I get to live them every day." Winter mellowed into spring, and with it came the work of running a ranch. Beatrice discovered she had a knack for handling the chickens, and the small flock grew under her care. She planted an ambitious garden, vegetables and herbs she could use in cooking and preserve for winter. Owen expanded the herd as he'd planned, and there were days when he'd come in so exhausted he could barely stay awake through dinner. But he always made time to sit with her on the porch in the evenings, holding her hand and talking about their day. In April, Beatrice realized her monthly courses were late. She waited another week to be sure, then another, too afraid to hope but unable to deny the possibility. When she finally told Owen, he looked at her with such joy and wonder that she started crying. "A baby," he said as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We're having a baby, I think so," Beatrice said, laughing through her tears. "I'm scared, Owen. What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not a good mother?" "You're going to be an amazing mother," he said, kneeling in front of her chair and placing his hands on her still flat stomach. "And nothing is going to go wrong. We're going to meet our child come winter, and our family is going to keep growing." The pregnancy was harder than Beatrice expected. The summer heat made her sick, and she spent many mornings bent over a basin while Owen held her hair back and murmured comfort. But as her belly grew, and she felt the first flutters of movement, the discomfort seemed worth it. Owen was attentive without being smothering, taking over some of her heavier chores while still trusting her to know her own limits. In July, Beatrice was hanging laundry when she heard the sound of horses approaching fast. She looked up to see 3 riders coming hard toward the ranch, and something about the way they moved made her afraid. She called for Owen, who came out of the barn with Miguel and James close behind. The riders turned out to be men from town, led by the sheriff, a stern man named Carson. They pulled up in the yard, their horses lathered and blowing hard. "Owen McKay," Sheriff Carson said, and his tone was grave. "There's been an incident in town. The bank was robbed this morning and the clerk was shot. 2 of the robbers got away, but we think they might be heading this direction. We're warning all the ranches between here and the territorial line. Keep your weapons close and your doors locked." Owen's jaw tightened. "How bad is the clerk? He'll live, but it was close. These men are dangerous, Owen. If you see anything, send someone to town immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." After the sheriff and his men rode on to warn the next ranch, Owen gathered everyone together. "Miguel, James, Tommy, I want you to stay close to the house and bunkhouse. Keep your rifles handy. Beatrice, I want you inside with the doors barred." "I can shoot," Beatrice said. "My father taught me when I was young." Owen looked surprised, then nodded. "There's a rifle in the parlor and a pistol in our bedroom, but I pray to God you won't need to use them." The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation, everyone jumping at shadows. As night fell, Owen insisted Beatrice go to bed, but she couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness, one hand on her growing belly, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night. Around midnight she heard it. The soft whicker of a horse that didn't belong, the creak of the barn door. She got up quickly, pulling on her robe, and went to wake Owen. He was already awake, sitting up in bed with the pistol in his hand. "You heard it too," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. They moved through the dark house together, Owen in the lead. Through the kitchen window, they could see a light in the barn. Someone was definitely there. Owen sent Beatrice to wake the hands while he watched the barn, and within minutes, Miguel, James, and Tommy were armed and ready. "Could be someone just needing shelter," Miguel said quietly. "But we have to assume it's not." They approached the barn carefully, Owen in the lead with his rifle. When they threw open the door, they found 2 men inside, trying to steal fresh horses. One was young, maybe 19, with a wild look in his eyes. The other was older, maybe 40, with a hard face and a gun already drawn. "Don't move," Owen said, his rifle trained on the older man. "Drop your weapon." For a moment no one moved. Then the older man smiled, mean and cold. "You're not going to shoot me, farmer. You don't have the sand." "Try me," Owen said, and there was steel in his voice that Beatrice had never heard before. "My wife is pregnant and you're threatening everything I've built. Believe me, I'll pull this trigger." Something in his tone must have convinced the older man, because he slowly lowered his gun and let it fall to the hay-covered floor. The younger man followed suit, and Tommy and James moved in to tie their hands. "Miguel, ride to town and get the sheriff," Owen said, never taking his eyes off the prisoners. "James, help him saddle a fresh horse." It took 3 hours for the sheriff to arrive with his deputies. By then, Owen had the 2 robbers secured in the tack room with Miguel and Tommy standing guard, rifles ready. Beatrice had stayed in the house as Owen insisted, but she'd watched from the window, her own rifle across her lap, prepared to defend her home if necessary. When Sheriff Carson finally arrived and took the robbers into custody, he clapped Owen on the shoulder. "Good work. These 2 have been wanted for more than just today's robbery. There's a reward, probably around $200 once it's all sorted." After the sheriff left with his prisoners, Owen came back to the house to find Beatrice still sitting in the parlor, rifle across her lap, eyes wide. He knelt in front of her and gently took the weapon, setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he said against her hair. "Everyone's safe. You're safe, the baby's safe." "I was so scared," Beatrice admitted, holding onto him tightly. "When I saw those men, I thought about everything we could lose. But we didn't lose it. We protected it together." He pulled back to look at her. "You were brave tonight, Beatrice. Braver than you needed to be. I'm proud to call you my wife." The incident brought them even closer, if that was possible. Beatrice realized that the fear she'd felt wasn't about losing hope or happiness in some abstract way. It was about losing Owen specifically, losing their child, losing the concrete life they'd built together. And that fear, while terrifying, was also proof that she'd healed. She wasn't afraid to love anymore. She was just afraid to lose what she loved, which was a very different thing. Summer faded into autumn, and Beatrice's belly grew round and full. The reward money came through, and Owen used it to buy supplies for the baby and to build an addition onto the house. 2 new rooms, one for a nursery and one for future children. It was a declaration of faith in their future that made Beatrice cry happy tears. In November, exactly 1 year after Owen had proposed, Beatrice went into labor. Mrs. Patterson came out from town to help, along with the doctor, and Owen paced the porch with his hands while Beatrice worked to bring their child into the world. It was long and hard, and there were moments when she was certain she couldn't do it. But then she'd hear Owen's voice through the door, calling encouragement, and she'd find the strength to push again. Their son was born just after dawn on a cold November morning. He came into the world squalling and red-faced, perfect in every way. When the doctor finally let Owen into the room, he knelt beside the bed where Beatrice held their baby and cried openly. "We have a son," Beatrice said, exhausted but radiant. "Owen, we have a son." "What should we name him?" Owen asked, stroking the baby's downy head with one finger. They'd discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at her husband's awed face, Beatrice knew exactly what their son should be called. "Matthew," she said. "It means gift from God, because that's what this is, what you are, gifts I never thought I'd receive." "Matthew McKay," Owen said, trying it out. He looked at Beatrice with so much love she felt it like a physical thing. "He's perfect. You're perfect. I love you both more than words can say." The early days of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Matthew was a demanding baby, wanting to nurse frequently and sleeping in short bursts. But every time Beatrice looked at his tiny face or felt his small hand curl around her finger, she felt a joy so profound it almost hurt. Owen was a devoted father, walking the floor with Matthew when he was fussy, changing nappies without complaint, singing to him in a surprisingly good voice. Winter settled over the ranch, but inside the house, there was warmth and life. Miguel carved toys for the baby, James brought a cradle he'd made in the bunkhouse, and Tommy proved to have a gift for making Matthew laugh. They'd become a family, all of them, bound together by more than just employment. On Christmas Eve, their second as a married couple but their first as parents, Beatrice and Owen sat together in the rocking chair in the nursery, watching Matthew sleep in his cradle. Snow fell softly outside the window, and the house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire in the next room. "Do you remember last year?" Owen asked quietly. "When I gave you that locket?" "I remember," Beatrice said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I said I didn't need memories in a locket because I got to live them every day. Do you still feel that way?" She thought about the year that had passed. The spring planting, the summer heat, the fear when the robbers came, the joy of feeling their baby move inside her, the pain and triumph of Matthew's birth. Every moment, good and difficult, had been precious because they'd faced it together. "Even more so now," she said. "This life we've built, it's better than any happy ending I ever imagined before I gave up on them entirely. It's real and messy and sometimes scary, but it's ours." Owen kissed the top of her head. "I told you I'd write you a new story starting from that moment. Are you happy with how it's turning out?" Beatrice turned to look at him, this man who'd seen her broken and offered her hope, who'd been patient when she was afraid and steadfast when she needed strength. This man who'd given her a home, a family, a future she'd stopped believing was possible. "I'm happy," she said simply. "For the first time in years, I'm genuinely, completely happy." "Good," Owen said, pulling her closer. "Because this is just the beginning. We've got a whole lifetime of chapters still to write." The years that followed proved him right. Matthew grew into a sturdy toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, curious about everything and fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified his parents. When he was 2, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier. Their daughter, Grace, was born in the spring of 1886, a calm baby who rarely cried and seemed content to observe the world with serious eyes. The ranch prospered under Owen's careful management and Beatrice's practical support. They bought more land, expanded the herd, and hired additional hands as the work grew. The house got another addition, more bedrooms for the children they hoped would fill them. Miguel became the ranch foreman, and James married a girl from town and built a house on the property. Tommy eventually moved on to start his own place, but he remained a close friend who visited often. In the summer of 1889, Beatrice was pregnant with their 3rd child when she received a letter that changed everything. It was from a lawyer in Missouri, informing her that her mother had passed away and left Beatrice a small inheritance. Not much, just a few $100s and some jewelry, but it was the closure Beatrice hadn't known she needed. Her mother had remembered her in the end, had forgiven whatever imagined sins she thought Beatrice had committed. She cried when she read the letter, mourning the relationship they'd never had and the mother who'd been too broken by loss to really love the daughter who remained. Owen held her while she wept, and that evening they added her mother's wedding ring to the locket he'd given her years ago, along with a lock of Matthew's baby hair and a pressed flower from their wedding. Their 3rd child, a son they named Daniel, was born in December of 1889. He came fast, so fast that the doctor almost didn't make it in time, and he was loud from the moment he entered the world. Matthew, now 5, was fascinated by his new brother. Grace, at 3, was less impressed but tolerated the intrusion with her characteristic calm. The 1890s brought changes to Utah Territory. Statehood was approaching, and with it came new laws and new opportunities. Owen expanded the ranch operations to include some farming, and Beatrice started raising sheep in addition to chickens. The wool brought in good money, and she enjoyed the work. Their family continued to grow. Another daughter, Rose, was born in 1892, and a son, Samuel, in 1894. Their house was full of noise and laughter and the constant chaos of children. Beatrice sometimes thought back to that woman who'd stood in Beaver's Main Street in 1884, certain that happiness was beyond her reach. She could hardly believe she'd ever been that person. The years and the love had transformed her into someone new, someone who believed in second chances and new beginnings. One evening in the spring of 1895, when Matthew was 11 and Samuel was just learning to walk, Beatrice and Owen found a rare moment alone on the porch. The older children were doing their evening chores and the younger ones were in bed. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting everything gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked, leaning against Owen's shoulder. "Taking a chance on a desperate widow with nothing to offer?" Not even once, Owen said firmly. You brought life to this place, Beatrice. Before you came, this was just a ranch where I worked myself to exhaustion and slept alone. Now it's a home filled with children and love and purpose. You gave me that. We gave it to each other, Beatrice corrected. You showed me I could trust again, that love didn't have to hurt, that I deserved happiness. You always deserved it, Owen said. You just needed someone patient enough to wait while you figured that out yourself. She turned to kiss him, this man who'd kept every promise he'd made to her that night 11 years ago. He'd written her a new story, and she'd had the courage to help him write it. And it was better than any ending she could have imagined, because it wasn't an ending at all. It was an ongoing story, full of new chapters and unexpected turns, but always anchored by the love they'd built together. In 1896, Utah finally achieved statehood, and Owen took Beatrice and the older children to Salt Lake City to witness the celebrations. They stood in the crowd watching the ceremonies. Matthew and Grace pressed against them, and Beatrice felt a surge of pride. This was their state now, their home in a way that went beyond just the ranch. They'd helped build this place through their labor and their family. The turn of the century found them prosperous and content. Their children were growing up strong and capable, learning to work the ranch and care for the animals. Matthew, at 16, was already taller than his father and showing signs of the same patient strength. Grace, at 14, had her mother's practical nature and was already being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher. Daniel, at 11, was all energy and mischief, always finding new ways to get into trouble. Rose, at 8, was gentle and artistic, filling notebooks with drawings of the ranch. And Samuel, at 6, was the baby of the family who everyone spoiled. In 1902, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again at 42 years old. It was unexpected, and she worried about the risks at her age, but the doctor assured her she was healthy and strong. Owen was both thrilled and terrified, hovering over her like she might break. I survived 5 births already, Beatrice told him with amused exasperation. I think I can handle one more. Their 6th child, a daughter they named Faith, was born in the spring of 1903. The birth was harder than the others, and there were scary moments when the doctor looked worried, but in the end, both mother and baby came through healthy. Faith was their last child, a final gift when they'd thought their family was complete. As Beatrice held her newest daughter, surrounded by her husband and her other children, she thought about the woman she'd been almost 20 years ago. That woman had given up on happy endings, had believed love was just another source of pain. But Owen had offered her something different. Not a rescue, not a solution to her problems, but a partnership. A chance to write a new story together. And what a story it had been. Full of hard work and joy, challenges and triumphs, ordinary moments that added up to an extraordinary life. They'd built a ranch, raised children, became pillars of their community. But more than that, they'd built a marriage based on trust and respect and genuine love. The kind of love that sustained through difficult times and celebrated the good ones. Matthew married in 1906, bringing a sweet girl named Ellen into the family. They built a house on the far end of the ranch property and started their own herd. Grace married the neighboring rancher's son that same year, a young man named Peter who clearly adored her. They took over running the neighboring ranch when Peter's father retired. The children grew and left one by one, but they always came back. For Sunday dinners and holidays, for help during busy seasons, and just because they missed home. The ranch became the center of an ever-expanding family, children and grandchildren filling the rooms and running through the pastures. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1909, Owen took Beatrice back to Beaver, to the very spot where they'd first met on Main Street. The town had grown over the years, new buildings replacing old ones, but the bones of it were the same. "Right here," Owen said, standing in front of what was now a dress shop. "This is where you were standing when I first saw you. You looked so lost and so determined at the same time. I knew I had to at least try to help." "Best decision you ever made?" Beatrice asked, teasing. "Best decision we both made," Owen corrected. "You could have walked away. You could have stayed trapped in your old story, but you chose to trust me to take a chance on something new." "That took real courage." "I was terrified," Beatrice admitted. "Of hoping, of wanting, of believing things could be different, but you were so patient with me. You gave me the space to heal and the reason to try." They walked through town hand in hand, past the church where they'd married, and the mercantile where Beatrice had bought her first supplies as Mrs. McKay. They stopped at the cemetery where Owen's parents were buried, and Beatrice laid flowers on their graves while Owen told them about their grandchildren. As the sun set, they drove back to the ranch in their buggy, comfortable in the silence that came from 25 years of knowing each other. When they arrived, the house was full of light and noise. Their children had conspired to throw them a surprise party, and the parlor was packed with family and friends, all there to celebrate the marriage that had become legendary in the area. The widow who'd given up and the cowboy who'd offered her a new beginning. Speeches were made and toasts raised, and at one point Matthew stood up to address the gathering. He was 31 now, a father himself, and he had Owen's steady presence. "My parents taught me that love isn't just a feeling," he said. "It's a choice you make every day. It's showing up when things are hard. It's being patient when the other person is struggling. It's building something together that's stronger than what either of you could build alone. They've given us all an example of what a real marriage looks like, and I'm grateful every day for the family they've created." Beatrice wiped tears from her eyes as the room erupted in applause. She looked at Owen and found him looking back with the same love she'd seen in his eyes that first morning after they'd admitted their feelings. 25 years, and it hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown deeper and more precious with time. Later, when the party was over and their children had gone home, Beatrice and Owen sat on their porch as they'd done countless times before. The stars were bright overhead, and the night was full of the sounds of the ranch settling for sleep. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Beatrice asked. "When I told you I'd given up on happy endings, I told you to let me write you a new story starting right that moment," Owen said, "and I asked if we could write it together. You kept your promise," Beatrice said softly. "Every word. You gave me a life I never thought I could have. Children, a home, a love that doesn't hurt. You gave me myself back." "You did the same for me," Owen said, pulling her close. "I was just going through the motions before you came, working myself to exhaustion so I didn't have to think about how lonely I was. You filled my life with meaning and purpose and joy. Our story is the best thing I've ever been part of." "It's not over yet," Beatrice said. "We've still got more chapters to write." "God willing, we've got many more," Owen agreed. "And every one of them will be better because you're in it." They sat there until the cold drove them inside, two people who'd found each other when they both needed saving and had built something beautiful from their combined broken pieces. The ranch that had been just buildings and cattle when Beatrice arrived was now a legacy. Home to children and grandchildren, a place of love and laughter and hard-won happiness. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and grandchildren, and the comfortable rhythm of a life well lived. Daniel took over the day-to-day running of the ranch when Owen's joints started aching too much, but Owen remained involved, advising and teaching. Rose married a school teacher and moved to Salt Lake City, but she visited often with her children. Samuel married a widow with 2 children of her own and proved that the pattern of second chances and new beginnings ran in the family. And Faith, their youngest, showed signs of being as stubborn and determined as her mother, with her father's kind heart. In 1920, Owen and Beatrice celebrated their 36th anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The small ranch Owen had built alone had grown into a thriving enterprise that employed dozens and supported multiple families. But more than that, it had become a symbol in the community of what was possible when 2 people chose to build something together. That night, as they prepared for bed, Beatrice caught sight of herself in the mirror. She was 60 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, lines marking her face from years of smiling and squinting into the sun. She bore little resemblance to the desperate 24-year-old who'd stood in Beaver's Main Street, certain that happiness was beyond her reach. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, coming to stand behind her. He was 66 now, his hair completely white, his hands twisted slightly from arthritis, but his eyes were still warm and loving when they looked at her. "I'm thinking about how wrong I was," Beatrice said, "when I told you I'd given up on happy endings. I thought that's what they were, endings. Something that came at the conclusion of the story and wrapped everything up neatly. But this is better than any ending. This is a lifetime of happiness, moment by moment, choice by choice. The best kind of happy ending is one that never really ends," Owen said, wrapping his arms around her. "It just keeps going, chapter after chapter, as long as you're willing to keep writing." "Then I hope we have many more chapters ahead," Beatrice said, leaning back against him. "Because I never want this story to end." "Neither do I, love. Neither do I." They stood there together in the lamplight, 2 people who'd chosen to trust when trust seemed impossible, to hope when hope felt dangerous, to love when love had only brought pain before. They'd written themselves a new story starting from that moment 36 years ago, and it had exceeded every expectation and dream. The ranch would continue after them, passed down through generations who would work the land and raise their families under the same sky. But the real legacy Owen and Beatrice left wasn't measured in acres or cattle or buildings. It was measured in the love they'd built together, in the family they'd raised, in the example they'd set of what marriage could be when 2 people chose to write their story together. Years later, when Beatrice was 73 and Owen was 79, they sat on their porch on a warm summer evening. Owen's health was failing, and they both knew their time together was drawing to a close. But there was no fear in the knowledge, only gratitude for the years they'd been given. "I'd do it all again," Beatrice said, holding his hand. "Every moment, every choice. If I could go back and stand in that street in Beaver, lost and afraid, I'd make the same decision to trust you." "I'd find you every time," Owen said, his voice weaker than it once was but no less sincere. "In every lifetime, I'd find you and ask you to write a new story with me." "We wrote a beautiful one," Beatrice said, tears streaming down her face. "Didn't we?" "The most beautiful," Owen agreed. "Full of love and laughter and children who will carry it forward. You gave me everything, Beatrice. Everything I ever wanted and more than I knew to ask for. You saved me," she whispered. "When I'd given up on being saved, you showed me that happy endings aren't something that just happen to you. They're something you build day by day with someone who loves you enough to do the work." Owen passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 nights later, Beatrice holding his hand. She grieved deeply, as anyone would who'd lost their partner of nearly 45 years. But underneath, the grief was gratitude and joy for the life they'd lived together. She'd been given a second chance when she'd stopped believing in them, and she'd made the most of every moment. Beatrice lived another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days tending her garden, teaching her granddaughters to cook, and telling stories about the old days to anyone who would listen. Her favorite story was always the same, about a woman who'd given up on happy endings and the cowboy who'd told her, "Let me write you a new story starting right this moment." On a crisp autumn morning in 1934, Beatrice Porter McKay passed away in her sleep at the age of 80. Her children buried her next to Owen on the ranch they'd built together, under the wide Utah sky they'd both loved. At her funeral, Matthew read from a journal she'd kept, entries spanning 50 years of marriage and family. The last entry, written just days before she died, read, "I learned that happy endings aren't destinations. They're journeys you take with someone who loves you enough to walk beside you through everything. Owen gave me that journey, and I am grateful for every single step. If I've done anything worth remembering in this life, it's that I found the courage to trust again, to hope again, to love again. And I built a life that proved second chances are real if you're brave enough to take them." The ranch continued for generations, the McKay name becoming synonymous with hard work, family values, and the belief that it's never too late to start over. Children grew up hearing the story of Owen and Beatrice, of how their great-great-grandparents had found each other when both had given up on finding happiness. The story became legend, then tradition, a reminder that love could heal, that trust could be rebuilt, and that happy endings were possible for anyone brave enough to write their own story. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Owen and Beatrice were together again, still writing new chapters in their never-ending story, their love as strong and true as it had been that day in Beaver, Utah, when a desperate widow and a kind cowboy chose to take a chance on each other and build something beautiful from their combined broken pieces.